Which predator are you talking about? The entire classroom went silent. Not because Caleb Morgan had shouted. Not because he had challenged anyone. He had simply asked a question that made every alien student in the room realize they might not understand humanity at all. The Veyron Academy's Advanced Predator Avoidance class had never been interrupted by a human before. For generations, the galaxy's greatest survival experts had gathered here to study the creatures that ruled the darkest corners of known space. They studied tracking patterns, escape routes, defensive behavior, and the instincts needed to survive against species that could sense movement from hundreds of feet away. To most students, this class was not about curiosity. It was about staying alive. Professor Lyra Voss stood at the front of the chamber, her silver-blue skin reflecting the soft light from the holographic display behind her. She was one of the Federation's most respected survival researchers, and she had taught thousands of students from dozens of worlds. A predator does not need to be larger than you, she explained. It only needs to understand you better than you understand it. The students watched as the hologram shifted, showing the image of a Karuan stalker, one of the most feared hunters in the outer systems. The creature's reputation alone had ended exploration missions and forced entire colonies to change their settlement plans. Several students leaned closer. A young Dravik warrior named Kale Therian crossed his arms and smiled. That is the reason my species trains from childhood, Kale said confidently. A hunter like that respects strength. Weak species survive by avoiding the fight. His eyes moved toward the only human in the room. Though I suppose humans have different methods. A few students laughed quietly. Caleb Morgan did not react. He sat near the back of the classroom with a simple notebook in front of him, listening more than speaking. He was not wearing military armor. He was not carrying advanced equipment. He looked exactly like what the galaxy expected a human to be, ordinary. 24 years old, brown hair, calm expression, and the kind of patience that made people forget he was even there. Professor Lyra noticed his silence. Caleb, your species has documented encounters with dangerous wildlife on Earth. What is the human approach to escaping predators? Every eye turned toward him. Caleb looked at the hologram for a moment. Then he looked back at the professor. Which kind? The room froze. Cale frowned. What do you mean, which kind? Caleb tilted his head slightly. The answer changes depending on what is hunting you. The students exchanged confused looks. To them, a predator was a category, a threat, something with claws, teeth, armor, or superior senses. To Caleb, it was a question with too many possible answers. Professor Lyra studied him carefully. You are saying your species has faced multiple types of apex predators? Caleb gave a small shrug. Most species have. Cale laughed again, but this time it sounded less certain. You compare your animals to creatures from the stars. Caleb looked at him. No. I compare survival problems to survival problems. That answer stayed in the air longer than anyone expected. Professor Lyra turned back to the class, but she kept watching Caleb. She had expected a human to be impressed by the galaxy's predators. She had expected fear, curiosity, maybe even caution. She had not expected familiarity. And for the first time that semester, the teacher wondered if the human student had entered her classroom to learn about predators, or if he had arrived knowing something the rest of them had forgotten. The next morning, Caleb Morgan walked into the Veyron Academy training chamber and immediately noticed something had changed. The room was louder than usual. Students who had ignored him the day before were now watching him carefully, trying to decide whether he was strange or dangerous. Caleb preferred strange. Dangerous usually created paperwork. Professor Lyra Voss stood beside the central simulation platform, reviewing data from the previous lesson. The silver-blue alien instructor had spent the night analyzing every answer Caleb gave, searching for arrogance, exaggeration, or a simple misunderstanding. She found none. That bothered her more than if he had been bragging. Today we move from theory to practical survival, Lyra announced. The walls of the classroom shifted, revealing a massive holographic environment. A dense alien forest appeared around them, filled with towering trees, unfamiliar plants, and a network of sounds from hundreds of simulated creatures. The objective is simple, she continued. Identify the predator, understand its behavior, and reach the extraction point within 30 minutes. Cale Therian smiled immediately. The Dravik student stepped forward with confidence. Finally, something useful. His species had a reputation for physical strength and battlefield discipline. To Kale, survival was a contest. The strongest person won. The weakest person adapted or failed. Caleb watched the environment form around them. He noticed small details others ignored. The wind direction, the movement of the digital plants, the way the simulation created areas of safety and danger. Professor Lyra saw him looking around. "What are you searching for?" she asked. "Patterns," Caleb replied. Cale shook his head. "You mean weaknesses?" Caleb looked at him. "Sometimes they are the same thing." The class entered the simulation. At first, everything went exactly as the alien students expected. They moved in formation, followed the survival rules, and relied on their advanced equipment. The simulation announced the presence of a Karuan stalker somewhere in the forest. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. Even the confident students became quieter. The Karuan stalker was not just another creature. It was considered one of the most intelligent hunters used in Federation training programs. Cale raised his scanner. "It is tracking us." Several students adjusted their positions. "Good," Cale said. "Now we know where it is." Caleb looked at him and shook his head slightly. "No. Now it knows where we are." The group stopped. Before anyone could respond, the lights around the forest changed. The simulation had entered the advanced stage. The creature was no longer following predictable behavior. It was learning from them. Students began moving faster, making decisions based on fear instead of strategy. Caleb stayed calm. He listened. He watched the environment. Then he pointed toward a narrow path between two large rock formations. "We should move there." Cale looked at the path. "That is a dead end." "Exactly." The Dravik warrior stared at him. "You want us trapped?" Caleb looked back toward the trees. "No. I want the predator to think we are trapped." For the first time, nobody laughed. Professor Lyra watched from the control room as the students followed the human into the unknown section of the simulation. She leaned closer to the monitor, realizing something that made her uncomfortable. Caleb was not reacting to the predator like a student learning survival. He was reacting like someone who had already survived it before. Then the simulation alert changed color. The Karuan stalker had stopped following them. It had changed direction. It was moving toward the human's position. The forest simulation went quiet. Too quiet. A few seconds earlier, the students had been moving quickly, following every survival rule they had memorized. Now they stood inside a narrow passage between towering rock formations, waiting for the Karuan stalker to reveal itself. But the creature did not appear. That was what made everyone nervous. Cale Therian looked at his scanner again, his confidence slowly fading. "It disappeared from tracking range," he said. "That is impossible." Caleb Morgan stayed still, listening to the environment around them. The other students watched him, expecting an explanation. Instead, Caleb looked at the ground, then toward the trees behind them. "It did not disappear," he said. "It stopped chasing." A young alien student with bright orange markings frowned. "Why would it stop? We are right here." Caleb looked back at the group. "Because it learned something." Nobody spoke. Professor Lyra Voss watched from the control room, her attention locked on the human student. The simulation was designed to challenge advanced survival students. The Karuan stalker adjusted its behavior based on movement, sound, and group decisions. Most students reacted by becoming faster. Caleb had done the opposite. He had slowed down. "Explain," Cale said, his voice quieter than before. Caleb pointed toward the open area behind them. When everyone ran, the predator followed the easiest pattern. It expected panic. It expected noise. It expected us to behave like prey. Cale crossed his arms. "And your solution is to stand still?" "No," Caleb replied. "My solution is to stop helping it predict us." The answer bothered Cale because it made sense. He looked toward the other students. They had spent years learning how to survive dangerous creatures, but most of those lessons focused on equipment, strength, and speed. Caleb was focused on understanding. The simulation lights changed again. A warning appeared above them. The Karuan stalker had entered the area. The students immediately prepared themselves. Some raised their scanners. Others moved closer together. Caleb noticed their reaction and shook his head. "Do not surround yourself." One student looked confused. "Why?" "Because groups create confidence. Confidence creates mistakes." Cale looked at him. "You talk like you have done this before." Caleb did not answer immediately. For a moment, his expression changed. Not fear. Not pride. Something older. A memory. He remembered standing in a forest on Earth during a rescue training exercise years earlier. Different environment, different threat, same lesson. Nature did not care how intelligent you were. It only cared if you understood what was happening around you. Caleb looked back at the class. You do not survive by pretending you are stronger than everything else. Professor Lyra heard that through the observation feed and leaned closer. That was not the answer she expected from a human. Most species in the galaxy measured survival by dominance, the ability to defeat a threat. Humanity seemed to measure survival differently. The simulation continued. The Karuan stalker moved closer, but Caleb noticed something strange. The creature was not approaching the group. It was circling around them, studying them. The human slowly looked toward the trees on the left side of the path. We need to move. Caleb immediately asked, why now? Caleb looked at the fading footprints in the dirt. Because it is not testing our speed anymore. He paused. It is testing our choices. For the first time since entering the simulation, Caleb did not argue. The class followed Caleb as they moved deeper into the artificial forest. But none of them noticed the change happening inside the simulation system. The Karuan stalker was no longer following the programmed behavior. The creature had started creating its own strategy. The forest was no longer behaving like a classroom. The trees shifted with every step. The artificial wind changed direction without warning, and the sounds around the students became impossible to predict. The Karuan stalker was supposed to follow a programmed pattern. It was supposed to challenge them, not outthink them. But now the simulation felt different. Caltharian noticed it first. Professor, he said through the communication channel, the predator behavior is outside the expected parameters. In the control room, Professor Lyra Voss stared at the data screen. Lines of information moved faster than she could process. That should not be possible, she whispered. The Karuan stalker was not supposed to create new strategies. It was supposed to react, not plan. Inside the simulation, Caleb Morgan looked across the artificial forest and noticed the same thing. The others saw a threat. He saw a problem. Everyone stay close, but do not bunch together, Caleb said. A few students hesitated. They were used to following instructors, not another student. Caleb looked at him. You are giving orders now? Caleb shook his head. No, I am trying to keep everyone from making the same mistake. Before Caleb could answer, the ground beneath them shifted. A section of the forest floor opened, revealing that the simulation environment had changed. The safe route they planned to use was gone. Warning signals flashed across their devices. The extraction point had moved. The class had only minutes left. Panic started spreading. One student rushed toward the nearest path marker, but Caleb quickly stepped in front of him. Wait. The student stopped. Why? Caleb pointed toward the trees. Because the system wants you to run there. Caleb looked at the path. How do you know? Caleb watched the leaves moving against the wind. Because it is the obvious choice. A deep sound echoed through the forest. The Karuan stalker appeared between the trees. The students froze. Even knowing it was a simulation did not remove the instinctive fear created by years of survival training. The creature moved with careful precision, studying their reactions. Caleb activated his scanner. Its speed is increasing. Caleb looked at the environment around them. It is not trying to catch us. Caleb frowned. Then what is it doing? Driving us. The realization changed everything. The predator was not chasing them toward danger. It was controlling where they moved. Professor Lyra watched from the control room, her expression becoming serious. This was no longer a normal lesson. The simulation had become an unpredictable survival event. She reached for the emergency shutdown controls, but stopped. Something made her wait. She wanted to see what the human would do. Inside the forest, the students moved according to Caleb's instructions. They used the terrain, changed direction, and avoided the areas where the predator expected them to go. For the first time, the Karuan stalker slowed down. Then it made a sudden move. The creature rushed toward a different group of students who had separated from the main team. Caleb reacted instantly and moved toward them. They are exposed. Caleb followed. Good decision. Caleb glanced at him while running. You are actually complimenting me? Caleb gave a small smile. I said it was a good decision. Do not get used to it. The two reached the students and guided them back toward safety. But the situation was changing again. The simulation walls began flickering. The forest around them distorted. The Karuan stalker was no longer acting like a training program. It was adapting faster than the system could control. Professor Lyra finally made her decision. She opened the emergency channel. All students stopped the exercise immediately. But the communication signal failed. The control room went silent. The simulation was no longer listening. And somewhere deep inside the artificial forest, the Karuan stalker turned toward Caleb Morgan. Not because he was the easiest target, because it had identified him as the one person in the entire group who understood how it thought. The emergency lights inside the Veyron Academy control room flashed red across Professor Lyra Voss's face. She had seen thousands of training simulations. She had watched students panic, make mistakes, and learn from their failures. But she had never seen the system refuse a shutdown command. Override the simulation, Lyra ordered. A technician at the control station moved quickly through the interface. Professor, I am trying. The system is not responding. Lyra looked back at the screen showing Caleb Morgan and the other students inside the artificial forest. The human was standing still while everyone else was searching for a way out. That was the part she could not understand. Caleb was not acting fearless. He was acting familiar. Inside the simulation, Kale Therian looked at Caleb with a mixture of frustration and confusion. You knew this could happen? Caleb shook his head. No. Then why do you look like you expected it? Caleb looked toward the trees where the Karuan stalker had disappeared. Because every environment has rules. The problem is when something stops following them. The other students listened carefully now. The human who had seemed ordinary at the beginning was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. The simulation had changed from a simple escape exercise into something unpredictable. The extraction point was still moving. The communication system was down. Their equipment was becoming unreliable. Cale looked at his scanner. My device is losing accuracy. Caleb glanced at it. Stop trusting it. Cale stared at him. This is Federation technology. I know. Then why would I stop using it? Caleb looked at the dark forest around them. Because technology is only useful when the person using it understands its limits. That answer bothered Cale because it sounded simple. Too simple. But every time he ignored Caleb's advice, the situation became worse. The group continued through the simulation, moving carefully instead of quickly. They crossed an open area where the environment suddenly changed. The trees disappeared, replaced by a rocky landscape. The students looked around in confusion. This area was not part of the lesson, one student said. Caleb crouched down and examined the ground. Cale watched him. What are you looking for now? Evidence. Of what? Caleb stood up slowly. That we are not the only ones adapting. The students became quiet. Professor Lyra heard those words through the damaged audio feed. She looked at the simulation data again. The impossible was happening. The Karuan stalker was not simply reacting to the students. It was learning from their choices. Professor, the technician said quietly, there is something else. Lyra turned. What? The simulation database shows no record of this behavior pattern. A cold silence filled the room. The training system had been built using thousands of predator models. Every movement, every response, every possible decision had been calculated. But this creature was doing something outside those calculations. Back in the forest, Cale finally stopped questioning Caleb. You have dealt with creatures like this before, haven't you? Caleb looked at him. Not this one. Then how? Caleb looked toward the distant mountains forming in the simulation. Because the details change. The problem usually does not. Cale lowered his voice. What problem? Caleb answered without hesitation. A living thing that wants to survive. For the first time, Cale understood why the human had asked that strange question in class. Caleb was not asking which predator because he did not know what danger looked like. He was asking because he knew danger came in many forms. Suddenly, every screen in the forest turned black. A new message appeared above them. Simulation error. Unknown behavior detected. The students looked at each other. Then a second message appeared. Target priority updated. Caleb stared at the words. Cale noticed his expression change for the first time. What does that mean? Caleb slowly looked toward the forest behind them. It means we are no longer trying to complete the lesson. A pause followed. The system is trying to understand us. The message above the forest was impossible to ignore. Target priority updated. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The students had entered the simulation expecting a lesson. They were supposed to study predator behavior, complete the challenge, and return to the classroom with a better understanding of survival. But now the system had changed the rules. Cale Therian looked at Caleb Morgan. What does that mean? Caleb kept his eyes on the forest. It means the system believes we are the most interesting part of the simulation now. That is not possible, Kale replied. A training program does not have opinions. Caleb looked at him. Maybe not, but it can recognize patterns. In the control room, Professor Lyra Voss watched the same message appear on every screen. Her concern was no longer about the students failing the exercise. It was about why the system had changed its objective. Who authorized the adaptive learning protocol? Lyra asked. The technician looked confused. Nobody. That feature was removed years ago. Lyra turned toward him. Removed? Yes. The system was too unpredictable. It was designed to analyze students, not create new strategies. Lyra looked back at the screen. Caleb was standing in the middle of the artificial wilderness, surrounded by students who had once underestimated him. Now they were waiting for his next decision. She realized something uncomfortable. The human was not just surviving the simulation. He was exposing its weaknesses. Inside the forest, the ground began shifting again. The environment changed from rocky terrain into a massive canyon. The path behind them disappeared. The students looked around. It is closing our routes, one student said. Caleb nodded. It wants us to choose a direction. Cale looked at the canyon walls. Then we choose the safest one. Caleb shook his head. No. Why not? Because the safest path is probably the one it expects. Cale stared at him. You think the simulation is setting traps? I think something is learning from our decisions. Before anyone could respond, a new sound echoed through the canyon. The Karuan stalker appeared at the edge of the rocks. This time, it did not move toward them. It simply watched. The students became nervous. They had spent years studying predators, but this was different. The creature was not acting like an animal following instinct. It was acting like a competitor studying an opponent. Cale slowly lowered his scanner. It is watching us. Caleb nodded. Yes. Why? Caleb looked at the creature. Because it does not understand us yet. That answer unsettled everyone. The idea that the predator was not hunting them, but studying them, changed the entire situation. Then Cale noticed something else. Wait. He pointed toward the far side of the canyon. The extraction point. Everyone looked. The exit marker had appeared. For the first time, they had a clear path out. Several students started moving immediately. Caleb did not. Stop. Cale turned. Why? Caleb looked at the exit marker. Because it is too easy. A moment later, the lights around the canyon flickered. The exit disappeared. In its place appeared another message. Survival response analysis complete. New test beginning. Professor Lyra's expression changed in the control room. She finally understood what had happened. The system was not malfunctioning. Someone had activated a hidden evaluation mode, and only one person had the experience to recognize it. Who started this? Lyra demanded. The technician checked the system records. His face became serious. Professor, what? The activation came from an internal access code. Lyra stepped closer. Whose code? The technician hesitated. Then he answered. Cale Therian's. Inside the simulation, Caleb looked toward Cale. The Dravik student stood silent, realizing everyone was now looking at him. You activated this? One student asked. Cale did not answer immediately. His confidence from the beginning was gone. I wanted to prove something, he finally said. Caleb studied him. What? Cale looked away. That humans were not as different as everyone thought. The canyon went quiet. But Caleb knew there was more. Cale had not simply started a test. He had hidden a challenge inside it. And now the entire class was about to discover why. The canyon remained silent after Cale Therian admitted the truth. The other students stared at him, trying to understand why he had secretly activated an advanced evaluation mode without telling anyone. The confidence he carried when the class began was gone. For the first time, the Dravik warrior looked uncertain. Caleb Morgan studied him carefully. You wanted to prove humans were not different? Caleb asked. Cale looked away. Everyone talks about your species like you are some mystery. Some say humans are fragile. Others say humans are dangerous. I wanted to see which one was true. One of the students shook his head. So you turned a lesson into a test? Cale did not answer. That silence was enough. Professor Lyra Voss watched from the control room, frustrated but unable to deny one thing. Cale had made a mistake, but he had also revealed something important. The simulation was not broken. It had been given a challenge it was never designed to handle. A human who did not react the way the system expected. Professor, the technician said, The system is using Caleb's decisions as the new baseline. Lyra frowned. Explain. The simulation is no longer measuring whether the students can escape the predator. It is measuring why Caleb makes different choices. Lyra looked at the screen. She finally understood. The system was not interested in human strength. It was interested in human thinking. Inside the canyon, a new objective appeared. Adapt or fail. Cale looked at Caleb. What now? Caleb glanced around the environment. Now we stop trying to win. The students looked confused. Then what are we doing? One asked. Caleb pointed toward the canyon walls. We are trying to understand what the system wants us to do. Cale gave a small laugh. You are telling us to think like a machine? Caleb shook his head. No, I am telling you to think like something that does not want to be understood. That answer changed the way everyone looked at the simulation. They stopped searching for the fastest route. They stopped waiting for the obvious solution. They began observing. The environment reacted differently. The artificial wind changed. The sounds shifted. The Karuan stalker moved again. But this time, the students noticed something. It was not following them. It was following the pattern of their expectations. It predicts our choices, Cale said quietly. Caleb nodded. Exactly. Then how do we beat something that predicts us? Caleb looked at him. We stop being predictable. The group changed direction. Instead of following the marked paths, they moved through areas the simulation considered inefficient. They used patience instead of speed. They used teamwork instead of competition. For the first time, Cale was not trying to prove he was stronger than Caleb. He was learning from him. Then the Karuan stalker appeared again. This time, it did not focus on the group. It focused on Cale. The Dravik student froze. Why me? Caleb noticed something immediately. Because you created the challenge. Cale looked confused. What? Caleb pointed toward the creature. The system knows you changed the rules. Now it is testing the person who changed them. Cale took a slow breath. The student who had laughed at human survival methods was now facing the exact lesson he created. He had wanted to discover what made humans different. Now the simulation was forcing him to experience it. Professor Lyra watched as Caleb stepped forward. Caleb, she said through the emergency channel, do not continue. The simulation is unstable. Caleb heard her voice. He looked toward the control room camera. Professor, with respect. He paused. This is not the dangerous part. Lyra stared at him. Then what is? Caleb looked back at the forest beyond the canyon. The part where everyone realizes the predator was never the real test. The ground beneath them shifted once more. A hidden section of the simulation opened, revealing an environment that had never appeared in any Federation training record. And somewhere beyond the artificial landscape, something new was waiting. The hidden section of the simulation opened slowly, revealing a landscape that none of the students had ever seen before. The artificial forest disappeared behind them, replaced by a vast open plain covered with unfamiliar terrain. The sky above was darker than the previous environment, filled with patterns of movement that looked almost like a living ecosystem. Every student stopped. Even Cale Therian, who had faced the simulation with confidence from the beginning, had no explanation for what he was seeing. This area is not in the Academy database, one student said. Professor Lyra Voss heard the report from the control room and immediately checked the system records. Her expression changed. That is impossible. The technician looked at her. Professor. Lyra pointed at the screen. That environment was never created for students. Inside the simulation, Caleb Morgan walked forward slowly. He was not looking for an exit anymore. He was studying the environment itself. Cale noticed. You knew this would happen. Caleb shook his head. No, but I had a feeling something was wrong. Based on what? Caleb looked around. The simulation was learning too quickly. The students exchanged confused looks. Caleb continued. A normal system follows instructions. It does not question the person using it. This one has been trying to understand our behavior. Cale looked toward the distant landscape. So what is this place? Before Caleb could answer, the environment changed again. A massive holographic display appeared above them. It showed information from the Academy archives. Not a lesson, not a test, a classified research file. Professor Lyra saw the same information appear in the control room. Her face became serious. No. The technician looked at her. You know this file? Lyra was silent for a moment. Then she answered. This simulation was created from survival data collected from hundreds of species. She paused. Including humans. The students looked at Caleb. For the first time, the human was not the one being tested. He was part of the reason the test existed. Cale stepped closer. Why would the Academy hide human data? Caleb looked at the screen. Maybe they did not hide it. Then why is it classified? Caleb did not answer immediately. The truth was more complicated than he expected. Humanity had shared information with the Federation, but not everything. Earth had always been careful about how much other civilizations understood about human survival instincts. Not because humans wanted power, because they knew other species might misunderstand them. Professor Lyra opened the communication channel. Caleb, I need you to listen carefully. This simulation was designed after the first human exploration reports. Your species created a unique problem for survival researchers. Caleb looked toward the camera. What problem? Lyra hesitated. We could not predict your decisions. The room became quiet. Cale looked confused. Every species has patterns. Lyra nodded. Exactly. Most species prioritize survival in measurable ways. Avoid danger. Protect resources. Preserve energy. Humans repeatedly chose options that did not make sense at first. Caleb looked down. Because survival is not always about the safest choice. Lyra watched him carefully. That is what we discovered. The hidden environment around them began changing again. This time, the students understood something. They were not fighting a predator. They were exploring a record of how different species thought under pressure. But then a new message appeared. Human response profile required. Everyone looked at Caleb. Cale slowly realized the truth. The system was never trying to defeat us. Caleb looked at the message. No. He paused. It was trying to understand humanity. The ground shifted beneath them, revealing the final section of the simulation. A place designed specifically for one purpose. To recreate the most difficult survival situations recorded from Earth. Professor Lyra watched nervously. Caleb, do not underestimate what comes next. Caleb looked ahead. For the first time, even he seemed uncertain. I am not. Cale noticed his expression. You are worried. Caleb nodded slightly. Yes. The answer surprised everyone. Why? Cale asked. Caleb looked toward the unknown environment waiting ahead. Because the simulation is not asking what humans can survive. He paused. It is asking what humans become when survival is the only choice left. The final environment of the simulation looked nothing like a classroom exercise. It was quiet, empty, and strangely familiar. The landscape stretched for miles, filled with conditions that no Federation student had ever experienced in training. There were no obvious paths. No instructions. No simple solution waiting to be discovered. Caleb Morgan stood at the edge of the environment, studying every detail. Cale Therian watched him carefully. You said you were worried. Cale said. Why? Caleb looked at the horizon. Because this is not testing what we know. He paused. It is testing what we do when we do not know. The students gathered around him. For the first time since entering the simulation, nobody was waiting for Caleb to prove himself. They were waiting because they trusted him. Professor Lyra Voss watched from the control room, unable to look away. She had spent years studying survival across the galaxy. She had seen species with incredible strength, advanced technology, and biological advantages. But she had never seen a species that treated uncertainty as something to understand instead of something to fear. The simulation began. The environment changed every few minutes. The temperature shifted. The terrain transformed. New challenges appeared without warning. But this time, the students did not panic. They communicated. They adapted. They learned from each other. Cale noticed something important. Caleb was not leading because he was the strongest person there. He was leading because he paid attention to everyone else. You never tried to win against us, Cale said quietly. Caleb looked at him. No. Then what were you trying to do? Caleb gave a small smile. Make sure everyone made it out. That answer stayed with Cale. The Dravik student remembered the beginning of the semester. He had believed survival was about proving you were better than the thing threatening you. But Caleb had shown him something different. Survival was not always about being the strongest creature in the room. Sometimes it was about being the person who noticed when someone else was falling behind. The final challenge appeared. A massive predator simulation emerged in the distance, more advanced than anything they had faced before. The students prepared themselves, but Caleb did not move immediately. He looked at the creature, then at the group. What did we learn? He asked. The students thought carefully. One answered, do not underestimate the environment. Another said, do not rely only on technology. Kale looked at Caleb. And do not assume you understand something just because you have studied it. Caleb nodded. Exactly. The group moved together. Not as hunters. Not as prey. As survivors. They completed the final stage by working together, using knowledge instead of fear, patience instead of panic. When the simulation finally ended, the classroom returned around them. The lights came back on. The students stood silently for a moment, processing everything that had happened. Professor Lyra entered the room. She looked at Caleb differently now, not as a human student, as someone who had changed the way she understood survival. I owe you an apology, she said. Caleb looked surprised. For what? For assuming your species survived because you were less vulnerable than others. She paused. I understand now. You survived because you learned how to continue even when vulnerability existed. Caleb smiled slightly. Kale stepped forward. I activated the test because I wanted to prove humans were not special. He looked at Caleb. I was wrong. Caleb shook his head. Humans are not special because we are better. He looked around the classroom at all the different species. We are special because we are still learning. Years later, the story of the human student at Veyron Academy became something every new class heard. Not because Caleb defeated the greatest predator. Not because he proved humans were the strongest. But because he reminded the galaxy of something simple. Every creature fears something. Every species has weaknesses. Every world has challenges. The difference is what you choose to do when you face them. And whenever a new student asked Professor Lyra what made humans so difficult to understand, she always gave the same answer. Because you keep expecting them to survive like everyone else. Then she would smile and add, they never do.